Let me be very clear about something before I begin. I have filed 14 official incident reports in my career. 14. Most of them involved paperwork errors, one involved a junior officer accidentally ejecting his lunch pod into a star, and one involved me. This story is about the 15th report, the one that got me promoted. The one that also permanently aged me by what I estimate to be 6 full years. It started, as most catastrophic things do, with someone saying the words, "She seems harmless." Her name was Mara Voss. She was a human, and she had just boarded our vessel. Now, I want you to understand the context here. The Thalvine Diplomatic Corps had been navigating first contact with humanity for approximately 3 of their solar years. 3 years of cautious orbital observation, 3 years of intercepting their broadcasts, running their language patterns through 17 translation suites, attending 14 interspecies briefings where someone always, without fail, said, "They appear to be a primitive but curious species." 3 years of telling ourselves we had a handle on things. We did not have a handle on things. Mara Voss was assigned to our vessel as the first official human diplomatic liaison. She was, according to her file, 34 years old, a former structural engineer, and described by her own government as approachable. Her secondary file, which we had obtained through less official channels, described her as the kind of person who will fix your problem but make you feel slightly guilty for having it. We did not fully understand what that meant at the time. She arrived at Docking Bay 3 carrying one travel bag and wearing what humans call casual clothing, which in her case meant dark trousers and a jacket that had clearly survived events it should not have survived. The jacket had a patch on the left arm that said something in a regional Earth dialect. Our linguist, a Thalvine named Opik, translated it later as, "I have already solved this problem, you are late." Opik stared at that patch for a long time. I was the one assigned to greet her. Protocol. I am always assigned to greet people. I have what my supervisor calls a stable presence, which I have come to understand is a polite way of saying I do not visibly panic. I panicked internally, constantly, but externally, yes, very stable. "Welcome aboard the Serene Accord, Liaison Voss," I said in her language which I had practiced 112 times the previous evening. "I am Vok, 3rd rank observation officer. We are honored by your presence." Mara Voss looked at me. She looked at the docking bay. She looked at the ceiling, which is 40 meters high and decorated with the sigils of 7 interstellar treaties. Then she looked back at me. "You have good ceilings," she said. That was it. That was her first diplomatic statement. "You have good ceilings." I had no idea what to do with that. I wrote it down. The first 3 days went reasonably well, if you define reasonably well as nobody died. Mara settled into her quarters, attended the orientation briefings, asked intelligent questions, and showed what the ambassador, a senior diplomat named Zeal, described as a refreshing directness. She ate in the common area. She learned the names of crew members with impressive speed. She fixed a calibration issue in the secondary navigation console that our technicians had been arguing about for 2 months, and she did it in 40 minutes, and she said nothing about it except, "The 3rd gyroscope input was offset by 0.4 degrees, you're welcome." She was, in short, integrating well. She was also, we would later understand, being very, very restrained. It was on the 4th day that I first noticed the band. It sat on her left shoulder, strapped there like a piece of equipment she had simply forgotten to remove, or perhaps chosen not to. It was a dull gray color, about the width of 3 fingers. With a single indicator light that glowed a steady, unremarkable amber. I had seen it in passing before but assumed it was some kind of medical device. Humans, we knew, sometimes required external regulation of certain biological functions. I asked Opik about it. Opik pulled up the human equipment registry and scrolled through it for 11 minutes. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Opik was not an expressive being. He was the sort of person who could watch a sun go nova and say notable. He said, "Vok, that is a gravity compensation band." I waited for him to continue. "Humans," Opik said, in the careful tone of someone reading from a document they do not fully believe, "exist in a gravity environment of approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. Our vessel operates at 6.2 for the comfort of the non-human crew majority. That band is allowing her to function normally in our lower gravity." I thought about that. "So she is wearing it," I said slowly, "because without it she would need to adjust to our gravity." "Yes," said Opik, "and our gravity is lower than what she is used to." "Yes," said Opik again, in the voice of a person who could see exactly where this was going and wished he could not. "Meaning," I said, "that right now, on our ship she is effectively being held back." Opik closed his datapad. He folded his secondary arms, which he only did when he was deeply unsettled. I believe the human phrase he said is, she is walking around with the training wheels on. I did not sleep well that night. The fifth day was when Ambassador Zeal scheduled the formal diplomatic reception. All senior staff, all department heads. A proper gathering in the grand meeting hall to officially welcome the first human liaison to a Thalvine vessel. It was meant to be ceremonial. It was meant to be dignified. It was meant to last 2 hours. Mara arrived on time, which we had already learned was unusual for humans and meant she was taking this seriously. She was wearing what she had described to Opik as her formal jacket, which was a slightly less weathered version of the casual one, and she had done something different with her hair. She looked by all observable measures perfectly comfortable. The reception began. Speeches were made. Refreshments were distributed. Mara spoke briefly about the importance of interspecies cooperation and said 3 things that were genuinely funny and 1 thing that made Ambassador Zeal laugh so hard he had to excuse himself, which none of us had ever seen before. Everything was fine, and then Counselor Prath arrived. Prath was not a diplomat. Prath was the senior military advisor attached to our vessel, a tall, angular Thalvine with the social grace of a structural collapse. He believed in hierarchies. He believed in power displays. He believed very firmly that humans were, as he had said in 3 separate briefings, biologically interesting but strategically negligible. He walked into the reception, looked at Mara Voss and decided, in whatever passes for a mind inside his angular skull, that this was a good moment to establish dominance. He walked up to her. He used his full height, which was considerable. He looked down at her from that height. He said, in a tone that our translation suite rendered as condescending with deliberate emphasis, I have reviewed the physical capacity assessments of your species liaison. I want you to understand that we are aware of human limitations. You need not perform strength here. We know what you are. There was a silence. Mara Voss looked up at him. She had a very particular expression. I would come to know that expression well. It was the expression of a person doing a very fast calculation. That's kind of you, she said pleasantly. Though I'm not sure you actually do. Prath made a sound that in his species indicated amusement with contempt folded into it. Your gravity band, he said, pointing at her shoulder. You require mechanical compensation just to stand upright on this ship. If that is not a limitation, I do not know what is. Another silence. Longer this time. Mara looked at the band on her shoulder. She looked at Prath. She looked around the room. Every person in that room, every single one, was watching her. 12 senior Thalvine officers, 4 diplomatic aides, 2 communication specialists, and 1 very alarmed third-rank observation officer who had a very bad feeling about what was about to happen and absolutely no authority to stop it. Mara Voss reached up to her shoulder. She unclipped the gravity band. She held it in her hand for 1 moment, letting us all see it. And then she set it down gently on the refreshment table beside a dish of Thalvine grain cakes. Nothing happened for exactly 2 seconds, and then the room changed. It did not change dramatically. It was not an explosion. It was not a weapon firing. It was something far quieter and far more unsettling. It was the sound of a person shifting their weight, and that shift sending a vibration through the floor plating that our sensors later measured at a force 1.6 times what they were calibrated to expect from a being of her size. She straightened up. She had been standing straight before, or so we thought. But now we understood that what we had been seeing was a restrained version of straight. A polite version, a version that was making constant, unconscious accommodations for the fact that her body was built for a world that wanted to pull harder than ours did. Now she was just standing. She was not taller, she was not larger. Nothing visible had changed, but every instinct in my body, every threat assessment subroutine, every deeply buried biological alarm that 400 generations of Thalvine evolution had spent carefully refining, went off at exactly the same moment. Counselor Prath took 1 step backward. He did not appear to know he had done it. Mara Voss looked at him with that calm, calculating expression, and she said, You were saying something about limitations? Let me tell you something about silence. I have stood in the vacuum observation deck of this very vessel, staring out into the absolute nothing between star systems, and that silence, that total, consuming, infinite silence, felt warmer and more welcoming than the silence that filled the grand meeting hall in the 4 seconds after Mara Voss set down her gravity band and looked at Counselor Prath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I am fairly certain at least 2 people stopped breathing. I know I did because I remember very specifically deciding to start again. Prath was still standing there. He had taken that 1 involuntary step backward, and now he seemed to be processing the fact that he had done it, and the processing was not going well for him. His secondary jaw, which Thalvine officers train for years to keep perfectly still in tense situations, was doing something complicated. Mara was not doing anything threatening. That was the remarkable part. She was not flexing. She was not raising her voice. She was not doing any of the aggressive displays that our xenobiology briefings had told us to watch for in high-stress human interactions. She was just standing there, holding nothing, saying nothing further, with the particular stillness of a person who has made their point and is generously allowing others time to understand it. The grain cakes on the refreshment table were vibrating slightly. Nobody touched the grain cakes. It was Ambassador Zeal who recovered first. I will give him that. 30 years of diplomacy will apparently train a person to function through almost anything, including the dawning realization that they may have fundamentally miscalculated the physical reality of their guest. Zeal cleared his throat, stepped forward with the practiced smoothness of someone who had personally de-escalated 4 interstellar incidents, and said with a warm and absolutely heroic steadiness, "Liazine Voss, we are delighted to have you with us. Counselor Prath, I believe you were about to try the grain cakes." Prath, to his credit, tried the grain cakes. He did not say anything else for the remainder of the reception. I watched Mara for the rest of that evening. Not suspiciously, or well, yes, suspiciously, but also with the specific fascination of someone who has just been handed a document that rewrites everything they thought they understood. She moved differently without the band, not dramatically, not in a way that would make you point and shout, but in the way that a river moves differently when you remove a dam. There was an ease to it, a completeness. When she reached past someone for a drink, the arm motion had a quality that made the surrounding air feel like it had simply decided to get out of the way. When she laughed at something one of the communication specialists said and put a hand on the table for balance, the table made a sound. Not a loud sound, just a sound. The communications specialist, a young Thalvine named Fell, who was approximately 1.5 years into his first posting and was therefore still under the impression that the universe was a fundamentally reasonable place, looked at the table. He looked at Mara. He looked back at the table. He quietly moved his own hands off it. Mara noticed none of this, or pretended not to, which I later understood was a very human skill. They are extraordinarily good at pretending not to notice things they have noticed completely. She put the gravity band back on before she left the reception. She picked it up from beside the grain cakes, clipped it onto her shoulder with a single practiced motion, and said goodnight to everyone with the cheerful ease of a person who had attended a pleasant gathering and was looking forward to a good sleep. The room visibly relaxed when the band clicked into place. I wrote everything down. 14 pages. Single spacing. The real trouble, however, did not start in the reception hall. The real trouble started 6 days later, in the cargo access corridor on sublevel 4, when 3 crew members from the freight division made the extraordinary decision to haze the human. I want to be fair. Freight crew culture on Thalvine vessels involves a specific kind of initiation ritual for anyone new to the lower decks. It is not malicious, exactly. It is the sort of tradition that people defend by saying we all went through it without pausing to consider whether that is actually a point in its favor. The ritual involves surprising the newcomer in a corridor, making a great deal of noise, and seeing how they react. Most people flinch, some people shout. One ensign 3 postings ago apparently cried, and he later became a department head, so there is no dignity lost in the reaction. The 3 freight crew members, whose names I will record here as Dunn, Sec, and a third one who insisted afterward that he had only been walking past and got caught up in things, had apparently been planning this for 2 days. They had not read OPIC's report. OPIC had written a very thorough report, 17 pages. He had submitted it to 6 department heads and personally flagged it to the ship's cultural integration officer. I had read it, Zeal had read it, the medical officer had read it, and immediately scheduled 3 separate consultations with human physiology databases. Prath had received a copy and had responded with a single line that said "noted," which is the diplomatic equivalent of putting something in a drawer and sitting on the drawer. The freight crew had not been on the distribution list, so Dunn and Sec and the third one who was just passing by positioned themselves at the junction of sublevel 4 Corridor C and waited for Mara to come through on her way to inspect the auxiliary power coupling connections, which she had offered to look at because she was, at her core, a structural engineer who could not see a mechanical problem without being physically pulled toward it. She came through the corridor right on schedule. They jumped out. They made the noise. It was by all accounts a very effective ambush. Sec had apparently practiced the yell. What happened next took approximately 1.5 seconds. I was not there. I have pieced this together from 3 separate accounts, 1 security recording, and a very long and somewhat incoherent statement from the third crew member who was just passing by. Mara Voss, confronted with three large beings lunging at her from a dark corridor while making loud and aggressive sounds, did not scream. She did not freeze. She did not do any of the things that the freight crew's combined experience of hazing new crew members had trained them to expect. She moved. The security recording shows it clearly, though our motion analysis software had to run it at 1/4 speed to actually track what she did. It was not combat. I want to be precise about that. She did not strike anyone. She did not use any weapon. What she did was step sideways with a speed that the motion analysis software described in its report as, and I am quoting directly here, outside expected parameters for this species category, while simultaneously dropping into a lower stance that dropped her center of gravity in a way that made her, in the fraction of a second it took the three crew members to process that their ambush had not landed where they expected, completely impossible to predict. Dunn ran into the wall. This was his own fault entirely. Sek managed to stop himself. The third one, who was just passing by, had the presence of mind to flatten himself against the opposite wall and stay there, and then Mara straightened up, turned around, looked at the three of them and said, "Nice try." Just that. Nice try? Then she looked more carefully at Dunn, who was sitting against the wall looking significantly more shaken than a wall collision fully explained, and her expression shifted from the flat assessment of a moment ago into something considerably more practical. "Are you hurt?" she asked. Dunn said something that the recording's audio suite translated as a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. "Shoulder or head?" Mara asked, already moving toward him. "Shoulder," Dunn managed. She crouched beside him in the corridor. She asked 3 questions about range of motion. She determined, through what was apparently a very efficient informal assessment, that nothing was broken but that he had bruised something meaningful. She told him to put ice on it and go to the medical bay. She helped him stand up, which required her to take his arm and pull, and Dunn later told Sek privately that the pull felt like being lifted by something that simply did not understand the concept of struggling, which is a very specific thing to say and which Sek found deeply unnerving. Then she continued down the corridor to look at the auxiliary power coupling. The coupling, she later informed me at breakfast, had 3 misaligned connectors and a coolant line that was building toward a pressure failure that would have been annoying rather than catastrophic, but still, come on. She fixed it in 25 minutes. I filed the 15th incident report. Ambassador Zeal called me into his office the next morning and asked me to sit down, which he only did when a conversation was going to be long. "Vok," he said, "what is your current assessment of Liaison Voss?" I had been thinking about how to answer this question since approximately the moment I first saw her set down the gravity band. I had 17 pages of notes. I had OPIC's 17-page report. I had the security recording, the incident report, 14 separate staff observations, and my own 4 nights of disrupted sleep spent thinking about gravity and what it means when a species spends its entire evolutionary history being pulled toward the ground at 9.8 meters per second and decides that this is simply the baseline, the starting point, the foundation upon which a person builds. I said, "Sir, I think we have made a consistent error." Zeal waited. "We looked at the gravity band," I said, "and we saw a limitation. A human who needed mechanical help just to stand on our ship. We interpreted that as weakness, as evidence that they are, as Proth said, strategically negligible." I paused. "But the band is not evidence of weakness," I said. "The band is evidence of consideration. She wore it because she did not want to make us uncomfortable. She walked around this ship for days at reduced capacity, not because she had to, but because she was being polite." Zeal was very still. "A species," I continued, "that has to actively restrain itself to avoid unsettling its diplomatic hosts is not a species I would describe as negligible. It is a species I would describe as, at minimum, something we should think about very carefully." There was a long quiet. "OPIC's report," Zeal said finally. "I can send it to Proth again," I offered. "Please do," said Zeal. "Flag it this time. Red priority." I flagged it red priority. I also, for reasons I cannot fully defend professionally but can fully defend personally, included a note at the top that said, "Please read this one, the whole thing, including the part about gravity." Proth read it. I know because he came to find me in the observation deck 2 days later, stood beside me looking out at the stars, and said nothing for 4 full minutes. Then he said, without looking at me, 9.8 meters per second squared. "Yes," I said. "Their whole planet," he said. "That is what it asks of them. Every day. Just to stand up." "Every day," I confirmed. Another silence. Longer this time. "And they thought," he said slowly, That our ship at 6.2 was the comfortable setting. I did not answer because the answer was obvious, and Prath was not a stupid being. He had simply, like the rest of us, made the mistake of seeing a compensating device and deciding it told the whole story. It told the beginning of the story. The rest of the story was Mara Voss, 3 days before the end of the diplomatic visit, standing in the ship's physical training bay with 4 of our junior officers who had asked, with the combination of nervousness and irresistible curiosity that defines the young, if she would show them some human physical conditioning exercises. She looked at them. She looked at the training bay. She asked, "Have any of you ever done a pull-up?" She demonstrated. I am not going to describe in detail what happened over the next 40 minutes because the incident report is thorough enough and some experiences are better left as legend. What I will say is that Fel, the young communications specialist who had noticed the table making a noise during the reception, came to find me afterward, located me in my office, sat down across from me without being invited, and said with the expression of a person who has seen something that has restructured their understanding of the universe, "Vok." She did 27, without stopping, and then she asked if we wanted to try. He paused, and then she offered to let us rest first. He paused again. She was being kind, he said. That is the part I keep thinking about. She was being genuinely, actually kind. I nodded. She knew the whole time, he said. Didn't she? She knew what she was. She knew how we saw her. And she just waited. She is an engineer, I said, after a moment. They tend to understand that the best way to demonstrate a structure's strength is to let it hold weight, not to tell everyone how strong it is. Fel thought about that for a while. Then he nodded, stood up and went back to his station. Mara Voss left the Serene Accord on the morning of the 21st day. She packed her bag, said goodbye to every crew member she had learned the name of, which was most of them, and shook hands with Ambassador Zeal in the proper human manner that he had practiced twice the night before. She shook hands with Prath too, and Prath gripped back with what I suspect was an honest attempt at matching force, and something in his expression afterward suggested he had learned something from that handshake that he was going to be thinking about for a long time. At the docking bay door, she turned back to me. "Vok," she said. "Thank you for greeting me when I arrived. You were nervous and you hid it very well." I opened my mouth. "The pencil," she said pleasantly, and nodded at my hand where I was without having noticed, holding a stylus and turning it end over end in the way I do when I am anxious. She smiled. She walked out. I filed my final report on the liaison visit that afternoon, 14 pages. In the summary, I wrote 3 sentences that I believe will outlast most of the other words I put into official documents in my career. The first sentence, "Humanity is not what we assumed from a distance." The second sentence, "They are, by every measure available to us, extraordinarily capable. And they know it, and they choose most of the time and in most circumstances to make themselves smaller so that others feel comfortable." The third sentence, "I recommend with full professional seriousness and without any exaggeration that we update every strategic and diplomatic classification file we currently hold on this species because we have been, without quite realizing it, looking at the band and missing the person wearing it." Ambassador Zeal read the report. He approved it. He forwarded it to the High Council with his own note attached. His note was 4 words. It said, "Do not forget gravity."